A lot of things happen on dirt country roads. I mean, Bonnie and Clyde got shot up and killed on a dirt country road. The Bonner Party learned the fine art of cuisine on a dirt country road. In Texas, we got about 1 million miles of dirt country roads. And a lot of things get started there. Some marriages are even consummated on dirt country roads, frequently before the ceremonies. I was a young man at Galena Park High School, and tonight's stories begin on a dirt country road, namely Wallaceville Road. It's not like that at all now. As a matter of fact, it was then a deeply rutted, it had just enough shell on it to make white dust. But otherwise, it was deeply rutted, and I went out there after a football practice one afternoon from Galena Park High School. Dar Wilson and I were football players, and we went out there together to do some intensive human anatomy lab studies. And so we got about to the part of Wallaceville Road where Judge Parrott's JP office is, where my friend Cheryl Ropolo used to work as his secretary, and we pulled off on the side of the road on the shoulder there, and we got out of the front seat, and we got into the back seat of a 48 Plymouth sedan. Back doors on Plymouth opened front to back. It was kind of suicide doors. And we got back there and began our anatomy studies. And that got to be pretty intensive on this cool evening. So pretty quickly the windows all fogged up. We were breathing heavy in our research. And we didn't know about the sheriff's car that pulled up behind us. And we didn't hear him get out of the car and shut the door. The first we heard was, "Bam, bam, bam, get out of there." Well, we stepped out. Dar had on one sock, and I didn't have on that much. And here were these two big lumbering high school football players getting out of the back seat of a Plymouth on Wallaceville Road. He said, "What were you doing back there?" You have no idea. The first urge I had was, I am so glad you asked that question. But I restrained myself and I said, well, we were exchanging clothes, of course. And since his macho would not allow him to make a closer inspection, he couldn't think of anything else two football players would be doing in the back seat of a squad car except perhaps exchanging clothes. He said, "Put on your clothes and get your ass out of here. Don't want to see you on Wallaceville Road anymore." Well, we did what the man said, and I kept it. I followed his instruction, except I would visit Wallaceville Road frequently in the near future from that. It occurred to me that if I got busted in the 1950s for engaging in oral or anal intercourse, whether my partner was male or female, I would be in violation of Texas sodomy statute. And that was a felony statute. People went to prison for that. Now, it wasn't often enforced, but that was the law. And so I decided that what I needed to do was alert some people around me that might happen. So I decided to come out of the closet. And so one afternoon, Frankie and I were alone at home. Frankie's my mother, by the way, and I was raised in a family where my parents were Frankie and Raymond. They weren't Mommy and Daddy. They're labor goons, so they did everything differently. And so I walked into the kitchen where she was drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, and I said, "Frankie, I'm a homosexual." I didn't even know the word gay, but she did. And her response was, "That's certainly a relief. You don't expect that now, much less in the 1950s. And so I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, Raymond and I have noticed that you tend to dress up in coats and ties more than other boys in the neighborhood, and we thought you were trying to appear to be wealthier than we are. And we were afraid that you might grow up to be a Republican. But if you're gay, that's fine. We can handle that." And so handled it we did. That worked out so well. I went to Galena Park High School and I came out of the closet at high school, first slowly and then kind of generally, which only got me more business to take to Wallaceville Road. You know, a little advertisement will go a long way in this world. And so I started, and so I was quite busy over at Wallaceville. And then I graduated from high school. And it occurred to me that a young, muscular, athletic man with several pleasant surprise gifts from the Creator might actually turn that into a money-making proposition. And so I went downtown to take up the field of hustling. I didn't work out too well because I don't know about retail. And I was giving far too much product away. And I was so picky that I'd miss out the real money. And if somebody shortchanged me, that's fine, we can make another date anyway. So that was destined to be a false hope. But I did meet some interesting people. Among them was, at that time, former police chief Jack Hurd. Jack Hurd almost didn't make police chief in Houston because he was Catholic at a time when Houstonians were not very acceptant of Catholics. So after a long career in the police department, he was elevated to be the police chief. Well, by the time I made it downtown, he was an assistant director of Texas Department of Criminal Justice in Huntsville, but Jack couldn't break up old habits. He would take his state car, drive to Houston, and cruise downtown streets, where he pulled over and said, "Ray, what are you doing down here?" And I said, "The best I can." And he said, "Well," and so I would get with Jack Hurd and we would talk politics for hours and hours. He knew my father, he knew us, a political family. And Jack and I would go over to Old Jones Lumber Company and we would park in there amongst the lumber racks in his state car and we would talk about politics for hours and hours and hours. He just wanted to have somebody listen to him, and Jack Hurd is just like any other politician, sheriff, prison official. He's so full of bullshit. He just needed an audience, and I was a convenient one, so we would do that. And then one night, apparently there'd been some stealing going on at the Jones Lumber Company, and he looked in his rearview mirror, and here come a night watchman slipping upon Jack Hurd and Ray Hill. And Jack got to thinking, if I get busted with Ray Hill in my car at night, parked in a lonely place, my God, what the hell's going to happen to me? Because everybody knew Ray Hill was gay even back when I was a teenager. So we threw the car in gear and we went crashing through a chain link fence. He damaged the state car, but when you're in the prison system, you can always get that covered up. And we went running off. Jack and I would remain friends as long as he lived. I supported Johnny Clevenhagen against him one time, and that was the worst thing I ever did. The other effect of my going downtown is that I fell in love. Now, that stuff with Dar and all those guys from Galena Park, they didn't have anything to do with love. I think Tina Turner wrote a song about that. What's love got to do with it? That was all hormonal. Love had never entered the picture. I wasn't looking for a relationship. It was simply release, all right? But I fell in love. God, he was gorgeous. He was muscular. He was athletic like I was. We were a perfect match. And let me tell you, it was rough and tumble there in the clinches. It was nuts. But there was a problem. I don't know if Loving versus Virginia had passed yet, but Robert was black and I was white, and we simply had no place to go. We couldn't go to the YMCA because they had a YMCA for him and people of his color, and they had a YMCA for me and people of my color. We couldn't go to the Lamar Hotel where the downtown hoi polloi were doing all their tristing because, number one, we couldn't afford it. And number two, if they found out we were in that room together, they'd come throw him out and try to throw a woman in, and it was beyond the phase, passing phase stage with me. So we could go out to Frankie's. That meant we had to take a bus all the way out to McCarty Drive and get on the trolley to Baytown and get all the way to Cloverleaf, get off at the train at the rail. They just stop on the side of the rail and let you off. You want to get off Cloverleaf, we could walk a mile. By the time we got there, it was time for Robert to go back to work at the Texaco station. And so we didn't have any time to do that. We couldn't go to his grandparents' house. He lived right there in Fourth Ward because they live in one of those shotgun houses with bad foundation, and we get carrying on back there. We'd knock that sucker house off its foundation. And once we'd wake up the chickens. And so we decided that the only place that we could find a comfortable way for privacy and intimacy was the front porch of First Methodist Church. It was a nice front porch. It was all concrete back there, and they had like brick banisters. And I found out something about Christians. On Friday and Saturday night when they're out sinning, they don't look at the church. They're afraid somebody in there might be looking out to see them. And I'm sure they had lots to discuss in the patterns in the dust on the front porch when they came to services Sunday. But that's how we did it, and that's the best we could do. My friend said it wasn't going to last, and his friend said it wasn't going to last. I saw him 5 or 6 years ago in Disco Kroger, and he's still a good-looking man. I think it would have lasted if we'd given it a chance. So beyond that, we had the interesting time of the big police problem about that time was women in Levi's. Almost all of the police energy was devoted against Rita Wanstrom's The Roaring Sixties bar on Shepherd. Now, Rita Wanstrom was this big old raw-boned Scandinavian lesbian whose nickname was Papa Bear. Does that conjure an image? And she had a club where women went to dance and have cocktails on Shepherd Drive. And the police would come in and everybody would run. Some of the women would make it to the bathroom and take their Levi's off and put them on backwards so they didn't have a fly in the front. Not a pretty picture. And then I don't care if you bought the outfit at the finest Battlestein's women's section. If it had a zipper in the front, the cops came in, you were going to jail. So Rita came up with the idea of, why don't we hire Houston's finest lawyer, Percy Foreman, to take this case and resolve this issue once for all. So they scraped together $2,500 for a Class C misdemeanor with a probable fine of $40, maximum fine of $200, and they hired Percy Foreman to represent the poor woman that had been arrested for $2,500. So we all went down to the courthouse to watch Percy perform. I mean, this is a showtime. And we got down there, and Percy came in with his usual flair, and he put his hat on the defense table and his cane and his briefcase. He turned around, nodded to us, and went back in the judge's office. A few minutes later, he came out and said, "The case has been dismissed." And we said, "Oh, good, there'll be no more raids on lesbian bars." He said, "No, I didn't say that. I said that the case has been dismissed, and I'll take all the other cases you want to bring me for $2,500. And so that was not the problem, not the solution to the problem. So I got with Rita and I said, we're going to have to address this. And they said, well, why don't you take it to city council? And I said, I don't think it's time for that yet. But we did take it to Herman Short. Herman Short was the police chief of Houston. And Herman Short, Louis Welch, who appointed him, gave him an Imperial, Chrysler Imperial squad car. And it had a license plate on it that said Short. I've got somewhere in my collection of archives a picture of that car parked in front of the Roche Sharon Baptist Church with a banner across the front of the church that said, "Welcome United Klans of Texas." I mean, he didn't think there was any conflict at all with being police chief of the city of Houston and a honcho in the Southern Klan organization. I mean, that was Herman. But I knew something about Herman that nobody else knew. The night before he was appointed police chief, a friend of mine from Beaumont, a dentist, he had dentist offices in Beaumont and Port Arthur. You know how some of them double up, make a little extra money that way. And he was a gay guy, but not in Beaumont or Port Arthur. So he came over to Houston to be gay. And so the morning that Herman's announcement as police chief was on the front page of the Houston Post and the Chronicle, my friend in Beaumont called me and said, "Did you know your new police chief is gay?" And I said, "What? But what? What?" Well, I don't think I'd go that far, but what do you mean? He said, "Well, he picked me up in the Auditorium Hotel basement." There's a men's room that was very active at the time. And we went upstairs to a room and spent the night together. And everybody did everything. That may not mean anything to the rest of you, but to gay guys, everybody did everything is something very specific and very important information. And so what do you do about that? Well, you don't go call a press conference and say, "The police chief just spent the night with a guy." No, that is déclassé. So what do you do with it? Well, when Rita and David Patterson and I went to the chief's office to talk about the lesbian cross-dressing issue, Herman Short sat at the one end of a conference table and the three of us at the other end. It was much further than I have to project in this room for us just to hear one another. And he sat there and he said, "My officers are only enforcing the law." Well, of course, that's bullshit, but that's what he said. So finally, I got frustrated and I said, "Chief Short, I've got a friend who has a dentist. He's in Beaumont and Port Arthur. And he called me and said they wouldn't even put up with this crap in Jefferson County." Herman got strangely quiet. And then the next weekend, there wasn't a raid on a lesbian bar. And then the next weekend, there wasn't a raid on the lesbian bar. And so I went to go visit my good friend Larry McCaskill, who was the chief aide to Louis Welch, and I had to do something. If I wanted to talk to Larry McCaskill, a chief aide in Louis Welch's office, I had to come in the back door of City Hall, climb 3 flights of stairs, 3 stories, and knock on the emergency fire exit. And he would open the door, and we would step into a little closet right there. And that way we'd have because they didn't want me to be seen because I was openly gay coming in the front door. So I literally had to go around that back. And I went to Larry and I said, "What's the deal on the lesbian bars?" And he said, "Oh, that was Officer Murphy in the Vice Squad." I said, "That was who?" "It was Officer Murphy." "Well, what's the deal?" "Well, his wife left him for a big lesbian softball player by the name of Seal, Big Seal." I said, "I know Big Seal." And he said, "Yeah, his wife left him for her, and he's had it out for the lesbians ever since." And they moved him over to narcotics, and unless they got some dope in there, I wouldn't worry about it because he won't be back in lesbian bars. And of course, Rita Wanstrom would kill you if you brought a joint into her bar. So that was over and done with, and that's how that system was solved. Blackmail. Blackmail. That's how you solve these things. You know somebody's in the closet, you just go and blackmail them and get rid of all of that. After the Herman Short thing, we had gay bar raids in men's bars were relatively rare. But if you had a drag show going on, it was not unusual for us to have a raid. And the guys on the stage performing had to have 3 pieces of male clothing on, or they were officially cross-dressing. And so it was kind of funny to see great ladies in sequins gowns, but with a pair of lumber socks on, or some other kind of things. They had to have 3 pieces visible or they would get arrested, and that was the routine. The other thing about Houston's holidays is that we had Splash Day, just kind of the opening of the beaches in Galveston. And that was a great gay holiday. People would come from all over the state, this whole section of the world, and pour to Splash Day. As a matter of fact, if you were anybody but anybody in the gay community, you had to make Splash Day, Mission Days in San Diego, the Mardi Gras, the opening of the beaches at Fort Lauderdale. I mean, spring was your time of the year, and you had to dress for it and go for it, take impressive-looking dates to it. You had to do all of those things. And so we were down in Galveston in preparation for the Splash Day party. And everybody else went to Ties, which was a temporary gay bar that they opened with a large dance floor. I didn't drink. I'd stopped drinking in high school. So I didn't drink, so I didn't go out to the gay bars when it got happening. And so I stayed away from Ties. Ties got raided. They arrested over 300 people. You could buy any queer in Texas. The going rate was $120 bond. So they called me in Houston and they said they've raided Ties. Everybody except those that hadn't got in the bar yet are in jail. And they didn't have room in the new jail for them because they just built a new city jail. So they put them in the old city jail. Well, they're queens. They immediately organized and started decorating. It's a class trait. You've got to do that. They cleaned the place up. They put all the trash in one pile, and they found some straight guy that had been picked up by mistake, and they threatened to burn him on that pyre if they didn't take it all out. So they took him all out. I came to Houston. I went to all of the gay bars. I went to Effie's Pink Elephant, Verlon's Surf Lounge, to Hazel's Desert Room. And I said, give me all the money in cash register and all the money in the safe. Now, Hazel knew exactly to the penny how much money she had in her cash register and safe. Verlon didn't have a hint, and Effie had not sobered up from the previous year, so she didn't know. But they gave me all their money, and so I went down to Galveston, and I had enough money to buy 200 queers. So I got down there and I said, I'll take 200. They said, which 200? I said, I don't care. 200. You figure it out. So they started bailing people out of jail. And as they bailed people out of jail, they would get access to their wallets and they would bail other people out of jail. And so within like 4 or 5 hours, everybody that had been wound up in Galveston County Jail were now out of jail. And what was the offense? The offense was being in a gay bar. So those of them who stuck around and tried their cases all won their cases because there's no such offense on the books. And that's the way it was with us. We didn't necessarily have to violate a law to get arrested, to get thrown in jail as an illegal person. Now, when you got to court, you could win. But if you didn't get to court, you couldn't win. If you just paid the fine and got out, they got to keep the money and you got screwed out of it, whatever money was. By the way, all of those gay bars said they actually made a profit out of the money they took out of the cash registers and the safes, because we told everybody we got the money from the bars. and they all got paid back, and everybody presumably who paid for other people got paid back. There was not a dime lost in that process. Matter of fact, the only one who actually had good records was Hazel's Desert Room, and Hazel said, I made a couple $100 off of that. More people came back to pay me, and I said, well, they didn't. I commingled the funds. They didn't know where to go. She said, but everybody else did well too. So that was what happened to gay people in that era on Splash Day. It wasn't just in Houston, because in 1968, David Patterson, Rita Wanstrom, and I went to Chicago to the North American Conference of Homophile Organizations. That was the national organization of gay activists. And it was being held in the Trip Lounge on State Street. And so we drove up there. Actually, Dave and I did one of those drive-away cars where you take the ad and you get a car and you go there and give it to somebody and then see if you can find another car to drive back. And so we drove up to Chicago and went to the Trip. The Trip Lounge had been closed for 3 weeks because the cops came in and found two guys holding hands at the counter. And that was sufficient to close a restaurant in Chicago. And so we all met all day, and let me tell you, nobody fights like small, powerless groups. Franklin Kameny presented a resolution that we adopt the slogan, gay is good. Not great, mind you, but merely good. And that was debated, Gertrude, for 4 hours. I had to chair some of that debate because we wore out more than one chair in the process of debating that crap. And when we finally took the vote, it passed by a couple of votes. Didn't matter much. There wasn't but 18 of us there. There were 2 that showed up that didn't register, but there were 18 registered delegates to that conference. Of those, David Patterson, Larry Littlejohn, and I are the only survivors. The rest of them have died. But Franklin Kameny and I went out to the rack. Because, see, the rest of the country wasn't up to leather bars then, but Chicago, they had the rack. So we went to the rack to see what that was all about. And I'm sitting with my back to the door at the bar, and all of a sudden, everybody in the bar just goes like this. It was like Moses had parted them. Some of them hugged the wall, others hugged the bar. And I turned around, and 3 cops had come in. And I turned to Frank, and I said, Frank, can I have this dance? He said, I would be delighted. So after a little stumble about who is going to lead this dancing, Frank and I, neither one are great twinkle-toed dancers, but we figured that out and we started dancing. Everybody else was horrified. Everybody else was living in terror. But here Frank and I were just dancing. And the sergeant in charge of it came over and said, we know you people are in from out of town. And so they showed amazing restraint considering what they would do a few weeks later at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, which was a virtual bloodbath. But Frank and I got out of town without getting arrested and went on with their life. North American Conference of Homophile Organizations, an organization of people who in 1968, prior to Stonewall, had no movement to manage. We were all alone, a mere handful of us. Everybody else was so deeply, as a matter of fact, the chair of the organization after the convention had a phony name. Only Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings and Rita Wanstrom and David Patterson and a handful of others had their real names. We were scared. We were horrified. We did not think we had a future. We did not think we had a movement. Most of our constituents did not think they were worthy of it. And one of the reasons they thought that is because we had the impression of a boot heel on our necks from cops. That's how they controlled us, was with that fear. Right now, let me tell you something. If you're afraid to go to jail, they already have you completely under control. Your fear will control you. If you're not afraid to go to jail, they have a little harder time. Well, about this time, they finally figured out what I did for a living. They had been watching me very closely for my politics for years. As a matter of fact, Gene Kennedy, an IAD, Internal Affairs cop, and a CID, Criminal Investigation cop, was detailed to watch me. And he did. He kept an eye on me every waking hour of his life. And he filled out reports and sent them in. And then one February morning, I was in my apartment on Las Palmas, and I looked out the window, and there was that little unmarked Ford, you know, the one that looks more like a police car than the ones with the paint job. And it was 22 degrees, and there was smoke curling out of the back. It looked very warm and toasty down there. And I needed to go to Foley's because I had just had a suit made, and I needed to pick up that suit. And I was driving a Triumph, a little English sports car with a canvas roof and a wheezy heater. So I bundled up and I went down and I knocked on his door. And he cracked the window about like, "What do you want?" I said, "Look, all I've got to drive is a Triumph, and that ain't working in this weather. I need to go to Foley's, and if I left to go to Foley's, you'd have to follow me. We would both burn gas. We would both have to pay for parking. So why don't you take me in your car and save us all this trouble? It's nice and toasty." I don't know what you're talking about. I said, "I don't care whether you know what I'm talking about. I'll buy you lunch at the Men's Grill on the second floor of Foley's." Well, that sounded tasty. It was getting lunchtime. He was beginning to get hungry. So he said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but okay." So I got bundled up and went down and got in the car, and we drove to Foley's, and we chatted very little, but we chatted on the way down there. Picked up my suit. "Don't try to run away," he told me. I said, "Well, if you're not following me, what do you care?" Gene and I would become great friends, but it would be some months before he figured out that what I was doing for a living was I was a burglar. He thought that Russia or some other foreign country was sending me money to cause all this trouble about gay people, and I was active in the civil rights movement and the free speech movement, and remember all those wonderful movements, Gertrude? Wasn't that wonderful? And you had something to do every day on a different kind of thing and try to find some people to convert to your cause. And then I got busted in an antique store. What I did was I was a commercial burglar. I didn't break into people's houses and steal their cutlery. Number one, because there's not any money in cutlery. I broke into antique stores and warehouses, and I stole people's capital assets. And I stole things that queers know about: antiques, art, jewels, and electronics. That way you know what you're getting and you know what you can get for it. And I didn't fence stuff off for 10 cents on the dollar. I had probably the finest antique store in Madison, Tennessee, where I sold expensive antiques, upgrading the prices from where I stole them to pickers with a lot of money, and out of Nashville. And so, but when they finally figured out what I did for a living, they were shocked, because they thought I was underwritten to do all this movement stuff. Let me tell you, there's only two periods of my life where I actually lived above the poverty line. Once when I was preaching, and again when I was stealing. Now, they rewarded me for the former and punished me for the latter, and I always thought it should have been the other way around. But after they found out that I was doing that for a living, with great glee, they arrested me. They seized what property I had, but I had enough money for lawyers somewhere in another bank account. And I hired John Hughes. to be my lawyer. And John Hughes managed to get me 160 years in the Texas penitentiary. A bargain, no doubt. And so I went off to Texas Penitentiary, where I was an openly gay guy. But the headlines about the $4.5 million burglary trumped that. I mean, criminals don't do anything except sit around and read the paper in prison, and what they read is the crime story. And so $4.5 million burglary ring busted, leader refuses to identify co-conspirators. Hell, I'm a hero when I get there. The gay stuff ain't nothing. And so I start prospering there. I became the maintenance bookkeeper. If you ever spend a lot of time in prison, all you got to do is remember that if you will help that institution function smoothly, you will be rewarded. If you hinder that institution's smooth operation, you will be punished. So it's not hard to figure out which way you're going to go here. And so I'm in my office, the maintenance office, air-conditioned office, nice place for a guy in an unair-conditioned prison. And the phone rings, it's the warden. It's the big boss. It's Warden Sidney Lanier. Oh, Hill? Yes, the boss. You interested in that queer shit, ain't you? And I said, yes, sir, I am. He said, well, I'm fixing to cut 5 of them boys loose. They changed the law, and I said, I know. They repealed the old sodomy statute, and they replaced it with homosexual practice law, which is a Class C misdemeanor. Well, I got some boys doing time under that old law. They're all doing life for being gay in Texas. Life in Texas Penitentiary. And so he said, you want to go down and visit with them? It's the last day on the unit. And I said, I'm putting them on chain in the morning. I said, yeah, boss, I appreciate it. I'll get off a little early and go by commissary. I said, I got you covered. I left a ticket for you to go buy whatever you needed out of commissary. So get them some ice cream, some other stuff. It's celebration time. So the warden paid for the party. I went down to the wing where they were housed, and there were 5 old men down there. One of them you can read about in the Southwest Reporter if you're a lawyer. His name is Alvin Buchanan. Buchanan versus Batchelor is the title of the state, because Batchelor was the district attorney in Dallas at the time. Alvin appealed his cases, but not successfully. 3 convictions of sodomy, and he goes to prison for life. There were 2 others from Snyder. They were a couple, an Anglo kid, Anglo old man, and a Hispanic old man that had been together for years. And their story was that the Anglo's uncle was the sheriff, and he wanted the land that the Anglo gay guy had inherited to run his cattle. So every time they would come back, they would arrest them for being sodomites, charge them, and of course get them convicted, and they would go to prison. But the prison system treated them as a couple. They had the last cell on the top row. Nobody got any business back there but them. They shared that cell, and one of them was a bookkeeper in the laundry, and the other was a bookkeeper in the kitchen. They lived as a happy gay couple in Texas prisons. They were real excited about getting out. And the other 2 didn't want to talk about it. That's not what we're here for. Even on the day they were glad to get out, but they weren't there for that kind of a conviction. Neither was I, but I wasn't closeted about that. Well, I'm going to take a little break and go back and enjoy some relaxation. The next act will follow what happens to me as I get bolder and bolder confronting Houston police officers, and some of that is quite current. So if you'll excuse me, I'll turn the program over to our sponsor, and I will be back. One of the things that happened while I was in prison was the Dean Corll mass murders. And there I was, stranded in a prison cell, watching television, reading the newspapers avidly, and realizing that they never got the story right. Dean Corll may have been gay, but that's not important. He hated gay people. Dean Corll was convinced that every person that he murdered was gay. The national statistics are, in the case of gay violence, 40% of the people who commit that violence are themselves gay. It is, I think, psychologically something of it's easier to kill the part of oneself that you despise if you place it imaginarily in somebody else. That's what that was all about. And the gay community in Houston dove into dark corners and hid. Gay bars went out of business. Gay community centers closed and latched their doors out of fear of the reaction. And that's what can happen if you have a crisis and nobody is in a position to step forward and straighten it out. God only knows how many times I called Tom and said, this is the way this story should be approached. To straighten it out, to understand how journalism works, to understand the dynamic of what's really going on, to get the truth out of that. Do you realize that the Dean Corll scandal handicapped Houston's gay, lesbian, transgendered community growth for several decades? We were still overcoming that. And it's because nobody got the story right. Do you know today that there is not a gay person with openly gay cops coming out their ears? There's not a gay person assigned to homicide. There's not a gay person assigned to narcotics. There's not a gay person assigned to Vice Squad. None of the investigative divisions have a gay person in it. It's a conversation that I start with the police chief when I meet with him regularly. When is it going to happen? Oh, it's going to happen, Ray. People got to have seniorities, and you got to let them captains have some control over who. But until someone gets in there, it's going to be this confusing. If I got murdered tomorrow, there is not a person with a homicide division assignment that would have any idea how to investigate that homicide, because they don't know anything of what it's like to be gay, or to understand the gay community, or to be able to conduct an interview or an investigation in the gay community. When Paul Broussard got killed, the police department never investigated that. I went to Sam Nucci, who was destined to be the next police chief, because nobody was paying much attention to Elizabeth. Betsy was a great police chief, but nobody paid any attention to her. That was Kathy Whitmer's second appointment. And so we knew that the next police chief was going to be Sam Nucci. So I went to Sam and I said, I need better detectives. And he said, oh, God, Ray, with you is like wiping your ass with a railroad track. It just goes on and on. You're always in here wanting something else. And that's true. But I got Abbadondolo and I got Vacaris, who were two Greek bloodhounds who knew how to investigate a case. But they didn't know how to investigate this community. So they came back and said, we don't have anything to investigate. We're not going to solve this case. And I'd had it to hear. Weren't that they were bad cops. Weren't that they were ignorant. They just didn't know how. And I said, yeah, we're going to solve this case. Keep your badges and your handcuffs handy. And what did I do? I turned to the media. Susan Bardwell just died, but Susan Bardwell said if Ray Hill hadn't called me, I wouldn't have paid any attention to this story. If I hadn't called every other, Susan said, I worked very hard with Ray all day so I'd get a story worthy for my editor to give me front page placement. This is in the old Post. And she said, I'd go home exhausted and relax in front of the television. There would be Ray Hill with another reporter doing the story I'd be covering tomorrow. If you want something to happen, you have to make it happen. If you do nothing, nothing will change. I got out of prison, I came back to Houston, certain of only one thing, that I was going to be nobody for the rest of my life. I mean, I got this prison number tattooed up here, you can see it in the right light. And it says ex-convict on each cheek of my ass in case they somehow get separated. At any rate, I was going to be nobody. There was no hope. That's what happens if people go to prison. They don't make a comeback. My parents said, all right, when I came home and told them I was gay, they said, that's all right. The family business had been politics and organizing, but you won't do well in the family business, but otherwise we love you and everything's fine. Then I went to prison. They said, oh, it's all right. We'll love you. Everything will be fine, but you ain't going to make a comeback. Then I got out of prison. And I hit the ground running. We had to have some kind of organization working in Houston. I'd already shouldered up to Herman Short, so they couldn't come up with a police chief I was afraid of. And boy, did we have some bozos in those early days when I got out of prison. But I went down and I visited every one of them. And they all call me Raymond because that's what my criminal name is in. Look up my criminal. Actually, McClellan is the first police chief that calls me Ray. Everyone else called me Raymond because it's mandatory that they read my criminal record. Not just for police chiefs, for everybody. We got out, and Anita Bryant came to town. So we had plenty of time, thanks to Jane Ely. Had written an article, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? I remember the title of it. We had almost a month's notice. You can organize anything in a month. And so we started putting out flyers under people's windshield wipers. Come out this one night, you may never go back in the closet again. That a clever picture of a closet with hangers hanging inside, otherwise empty. And we talked it up and we talked it up. Since I was the convict, I'm the guy that deals with the police, right? So I've got to be in charge of security and negotiations with the police. So I called the police and said, who's in charge of special ops? They said, Pappy Bond. I said, oh, I know Pappy Bond. So I called Pappy and I said, Pappy, I need to sit down and talk. He said, come on in. I said, your coffee any good or should I bring some? He said, oh, I've got the best coffee in town. He lied like he was under oath. And I went in there, it was the worst coffee I ever drank, but I said, he said, how many people do you expect at the demonstration? I said, we're going to have about 500 people. He went to laughing. He said, we've gone through the civil rights era, the anti-war era. We've gone through all these movements, and we haven't had a demonstration in Houston with 500 people in it forever, and y'all are just queers. So it can't be that many of you. So I'm going to put you down for 75 or 80. 12,000 people showed up. Some straight people, a lot of people in this room showed up. 12,000 people showed up for that parade, that march. And I'm in charge of security. So they got a young officer, fortunately a good one. Pappy knows how to do that. Keep a young man next to me that keeps me in good shape. And so his walkie-talkie went crackle, crackle, and he said, excuse me, Mr. Hill, Captain Bond wants to talk to you. Here were the rules. We had to use the sidewalks on both sides of Louisiana Street and Smith Street. And we had to stop at the red lights. And so we have 12,000 people. that we've got to move from McGowan and Smith down to the space between the two libraries. At the rate we're going with 2 sidewalks on each street, we're going to be there about a month. And so Pappy Bond calls the officer next to me, and he said, Pappy Bond wants to, I said, Captain, what can I do for you? He said, take the street. I said, well, which street, Captain? We got Smith Street, and we got, take both the motherfuckers. I said, all right, Captain. And the young officer standing next to me had heard all of that, and he said, well, I'll radio the other officers. And I said, my people are not going to do what your officers tell them to do. They will naturally assume it's a trap. So I sent my parade marshals. Now, if you're the gay guy and you got to pick parade marshals, what can you do? You give them armbands. Well, that can be duplicated, all right? Or you can give them uniforms. That's too expensive. So I picked these little gay guys that are tiny and elven. And I picked these little butch dykes that looked like they were boys before they were girls. And I send them as my parade marshals. And so they went scampering up front. They said, take the street, take the street. Everybody moved into the street. Do you have any idea what that does to your crowd? We haven't gone 4 blocks. And suddenly we own turf that we had been previously denied. The vortex of the enthusiasm of that march, and there are people in the room that were there, goes swinging up. And it's a whole new game. It's a whole new world. These people had never been given any authority, any recognition, any acceptance in their lives. And suddenly they own the street. Doesn't sound like much from this perspective, but from the perspective of who they were when they were there, it was enormous. So we go down and we have a rally between the 2 libraries, and I get to speak to the largest crowd because I'm bringing up the back end. We march around Anita's hotel several times, raise so much hell they can't hear her singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. They didn't miss much. And then on our way back, as much because of Pappy Bond as in spite of him, I realized that I was dealing with a whole new phenomenon. In a period of about 2 hours, the term gay community changed from meaning the part of town where the bars are to a group of people with common goals and aspirations and dreams and hopes where there previously had been none. And on my way back to my car, which was parked a long way away from my rally site, I thought, I have a community here. And we have no institutions, Tim, to support a community. We have gay bars. That's fine. For those that drink especially, it's fine. I don't drink. They're dark. They're loud. You can't carry on political conversation. You know, America, revolution was created in bars, taverns. But they didn't have disco music and flashing lights. You could go have a warm beer and talk politics. And they drank a lot of beer, talked a lot of politics. We don't have institutions that can sustain that. We have to have other institutions. Next year, I plan to do a town meeting one where we have institutions, Montrose Counseling Center, Montrose Clinic, now Legacy Health Services. The institutions that were created in 1978 still exist and serve this community, give it strength and background, depth, culture. Anita came back into town the following February. It was like 20 degrees. The weatherman said it wasn't going to get any better when she was in. I wanted to call people to City Hall. Well, you have to do that manually. Houstonians don't have clothes for 20-degree outside activity. We don't. You know, I've got a New York coat, but how often do I get to wear it? And so I was making a round of the bars, to tell people, I know it's uncomfortable, bundle up, come on down. We've got to make, and he is coming back. It don't take many of us, it take a few of us. We go to City Hall, where we always go, to Rays Hill, where we're going Monday night, 5 o'clock, a couple of days, tomorrow actually, to raise issues. It's a free speech area. And so when I got to the old plantation, which is off of Shepherd between Alabama and Westheimer, I was in there fixing to get on the microphone and say, come to the rally, when Sergeant Smith and 6 vice squad officers come running in. Up against the wall, everybody, turn on the lights, turn off the music. Well, I knew Smith, he knew me. No sense in checking me out for being publicly intoxicated. I hadn't had a drink since 1959. So I sat down and watched him go through his motions. He shook everybody down, got everybody's identification, made 2 arrests. It was 2 guys that were there with their wives. I guess all those handsome gay men didn't help their drinking problem a lot. And then he started to leave, and he realized that the crowd did not go away. It surrounded the squad cars. All of his officers are inside. None of them have walkie-talkies. The squad cars are surrounded, and they can't get there without going through an angry crowd. So they started counting bullets. I kid you not. The officers got together and counted bullets. They were going to shoot their way. I said, Smith, you're going to fuck up. And he said, well, you go out there and dismiss them because we've got every right to. And I said, well, that first thing, because you got yourself into this mess. You ever heard of a place called Stonewall? You got yourself into this mess. First thing, you're going to release these 2 guys to their wives. They got somebody here to take care of them. And I'll go out there and dismiss your crowd. They'll listen to what I say and they will go away. But I want you to know one thing. I will tell this story to every subsequent Houston Police Department police chief as long as I breathe. Because right here, because of your stupidity, there could be bloodshed. Because of ignorance. Because of the lack of planning. So I went out and told everybody to come to the rally the next day and told them that the 2 people that had been arrested had been released, and they cheered. And then I got a rousting cheer from that crowd, and they turned around and got in their cars and drove off. And the cops got in their cars and drove off. We hang by a thread of some stupid police stuff that can end in tragedy. Gary Wayne Stock was a bartender at the Inside Outside. Knew him well because the caucus used to meet there. He'd always, as soon as I got settled, ask me 1 or 2. If it was 1, it was cranberry juice. If it was 2, it was quinine water. He'd bring me a drink in the middle of the meeting. Nice kid. A cop followed him from the bar down Westheimer to Main Street, left on Main Street, down, he was going to the Club Houston after he got off work to do a workout in the sauna. Cop pulled him over, shot and killed him. The forensics are that the bullet, of course, when I heard it on the news, the officer said he was trying to run over the officer with a Cadillac. But the windshield was intact. The side window was busted. And Gary Wayne Stock's autopsy said that the bullet entered under his left arm and came out his right shoulder. Exactly where was the officer to be in danger of getting run over with that forensics? I had an assistant by the name of Fred Pies, and Fred had always wanted to be a cop, but it was too soon. There were no gay cops in Fred's era. So Fred took that broken out window. Have you ever seen what a car window looks when it's shattered? It's just little bitty pebbles. And he put enough of it together that we saw that what broke the window was not in fact a bullet, but the butt of the gun. Smashed the window out with a little three-cornered impact sight in that maze of petals. And then Fred found out that the officer, Fultz, who had done the shooting, had a sister that lived in the same apartment complex that Gary Wayne Stock lived in. The problem was Gary Wayne Stock had the end apartment, and she had the walkway past her apartment blocked with used refrigerators and washing machines she was selling in the apartment. So he had to, when he got out of his apartment to go to work, he had to crawl over these washing machines. And we were getting pretty close to reopening that case because the grand jury had no billed Fultz for the killing of Gary Wayne Stock. And Fred was working on some other things. Fred figured out how the police were stealing stuff out of the property room, which was always a problem, and carrying it to Best Delivery Service over on Dowling Street so that it could be split up by other police officers and sold for personal money. Fred figured that out. It was Friday night before Pride Week. Fred and I passed an event. I said, well, what you got in mind? He said, well, I'm going to carry a friend of mine over to take a bus to carry some kids out to summer camp. And then I'll get with you. You got that speaking thing at University of Houston? I said, yeah. And so I got to the University of Houston to give the speech, and somebody said, well, what do you think happened to Fred? And I said, what do you mean what happened to Fred? And he said, he was killed last night by a police officer. Fred Pies, right here, most of the time. Right here. I mean, if I farted, he had to smell it. I mean, he was my sidekick. We were Roy Rogers and Gabby Hayes, and I don't know which was which. And I said, you got to be kidding. He said, no, he shot over on Dowling Street. So I gathered Kent Nas, who was my companion, together, and we got in the car, and we went to Dowling Street. I said, forget the speech. I got over Dowling Street, and I got to the corner of Capitol and Dowling. And they were making a movie. There was Johnny Holmes there. There was John Donovan, a Houston homicide detective. There were the two people that were on the scene, including the one that killed Fred, and they were making a movie at the scene of the crime. And over next to the fence, there was that bloody spot where Fred's brains were blown out. Johnny Holmes come running and said, Raymond, you've got the wrong impression. This is not what you think. I said, no, well, what it is. You're making a movie so that the cops' lie will fit together. You're rehearsing testimony in case there's a trial. I'll guarantee you there's going to be a trial. Well, I had to go through Johnny Holmes to get an indictment because access to the grand jury is through the district attorney's office. So I go sit in a hall at the grand jury assembly room so that every day when the grand jury comes to service, they got to crawl over my legs to get into the grand jury room. Finally, somebody said, what is Ray Hill doing out there? The assistant district attorney said, I don't know. It's illegal for him to talk to you. You know that. But I would carry the secretary's candy and flowers every day and be the perfect gentleman to the people that worked on that floor. And finally, a poor person in the grand jury said, bring Ray Hill in here. And he asked me what I was there for, and I told him. Told him about the movie. Told him everything. Kevin McCoy got indicted, and the indictment read, Gertrude, I remember it word for word to this day. HPD officer Kevin McCoy did, knowingly, under the influence of alcohol, knowingly and intentionally under the influence of alcohol, place a cocked and loaded .45 pistol to the back of Fred Pius' head, as a result of which Fred Pius died. A Class A misdemeanor. Because he was a cop, he would be tried in a felony court with a jury of 12 instead of in a misdemeanor court with a jury of 6. District Attorney Johnny Holmes assigned Brian Raines to be the prosecutor. Brian Raines was out of University of Texas Law School 2 weeks, had never sat second chair, had never tried another case, and it was his responsibility to convict Kevin McCoy. And I think Brian tried. Of course, I had known Brian since he was a teenager. Some kids try to leave home and it doesn't work, and other people take them back home. So Kevin McCoy got away, but Kevin McCoy is this day living in North Carolina running a racist organization. Where you find a homophobe, scratch deeper, you'll find a racist and a sexist and all kinds of into that. As a matter of fact, for 25 years I'm trying to get Houston police officer indicted, tried, and convicted for killing unarmed people. Finally happened with Eli Escobar, 14-year-old gay special education kid who was on his way to play some video games at a friend's house. Somebody made fun of him for being gay, and there was words, and the other side called the police. And the police came and to interview, and nothing, no blows had been struck. There wasn't anything to arrest for. But Eli was a late child. He had elderly parents, and he wanted to go home. There was no reality to the case. So he said, no, I'm not going to lay down on the ground. I'm going to go home. Officer Carbonneau grabbed him. Another officer grabbed him from the other side. They wrestled him to ground. Officer Carbonneau pulled his pistol out, put it to the side of his head, and blew his brains out. I went to the apartment complex that evening after hearing it on the radio, and as I wandered through the complex, I came to two 14, 13-year-old boys, had a piece of plywood down, some religious candles, and some greenery. They had built a shrine to their fallen friend. So I knelt down. I had at least one good leg then, and said, what happened? And they told me what happened. And as I got up to leave, one of them said, Mr. Hill, I know who you are. I have an uncle in prison. I listened to you on the radio. Can you help my friend? And I said, no, son, I can't do anything for your friend. Your friend is gone. But I'll try to do something to that cop. So I said, can you find me some witnesses? So one 13, one 14-year-old investigator canvassed the apartment complex, found 7 eyewitnesses. We got them all affidavit up, and I went back to see Johnny Holmes, and I said, I want this cop indicted, and I want him vigorously prosecuted, or I'm taking these affidavits to the media and make you look like the you deserve to look like. Carbonneau was convicted. He carried sentencing to the judge. The judge gave him probation. But I'm sitting there glaring at her, and she could feel my eyes in the back of her head. She turned around and said, and 180 days jail therapy. So Carbonneau spent 90 days in Harris County Jail. That's what you do when you get 180. And then he went on to try to serve his probation, which he has violated a couple of times. That's how serious it gets. 2 young boys underage. messing around, you know how two kids under 17 might do in the woods behind the community they live in East Houston, East Harris County. Little mutual masturbation, a little, how did I call it before, anatomy lab. Everybody had a wonderful time except the mother of the younger boy, who was, I think, 14. The other one was 16. She called the sheriff. Sheriff came out, listened to the story, and said, "Lady, that's kind of what kids do. They're both underage. There's not any big deal here." And so they both were, for some reason or other, on probation, one for shoplifting. I don't know what the other had done. So she went to the probation officer that they shared, and the probation officer said, "The other guy is an ideal client. Your son is a screw-up. I don't know why you're bothering me with this. I'm not going to violate anybody on this. That's not what we're going to do here." But she waited until the 16-year-old became 17-year-old. And she got the support of Stephen Hotze and a fundamentalist preacher in Channelview. And they got him indicted for sexual abuse of a minor. Well, they were both minors. And had they been a boy and a girl, there would not have been a law to indict him under. But the way the statute is written is it means two kids of opposite gender. But because they were both males, they got a felony indictment. And the judge in the court where it was to be tried got fired for getting sexual favors from the women he gave court appointments to. That complicated it a little bit. The visiting judge was John Hughes. Remember, he's the guy who got me 160 years. So I said, "I'll go talk to John about it." So I went to John's office and I said, "John, this is bullshit. Raymond, I am very seriously concerned about the age difference between these two boys." I said, "Well, you don't seem to be too bothered about the age difference between your wife, who is 40 years younger than you are, and yourself. That hasn't struck you as much concern, but you've got a gap of 40 years there, and you've got a gap of 2 years here." "Well, the statute allows," I said, "I know what the statute allows. But they carved equal justice under the law over the front doors of the Supreme Court of the United States. Ought that not to stand for something? And you're a visiting judge anyway. What? You hadn't got any balls in the fire." 6 years. 6 years. I held him in Harris County Jail as long as I could. So by the time he got to prison, it was basically a few months turnaround. Same time, another young man, gay man, in Pasadena, got a little drunk, had an altercation with a police officer. He was charged with aggravated assault to the police officer. To wit, he broke the officer's fist with his head. Fist with his head. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what was going on there. That guy's beating the dog out of him and broke his finger and is going to make an aggravated case out of it. 6 years, TDC. 6 years, TDC. Any of you get subpoenaed for jury duty anytime soon, this is what I want you to remember. All cops on occasion lie, under oath. Narcotics cops usually lie, under oath. Vice cops always lie, under oath. There are no exceptions. My lawyer has asked me not to show you any film and not go into great deal of details about the current case, but there was another case in 2005. I'm on a talk show with Rush Limbaugh out at a convention of talk show hosts out at the Astro Complex in that nice hotel out there. And my buzzer keeps going off. When you're on the air, that's very annoying. So when it got up, I returned the call. It is England who owns the bookstores. And I said, what's the problem? He said, well, the cops have taken over my 59 North store, and my clerk is scared to death. Will you go up there and restore my control of my business? I said, sure. So I got in my car and I drove to Astro, and the cops were still there. I saw them parked around behind. I made the block, came in, and as I pulled in the parking lot, I noticed there was the security camera right there. Saw me get out of my car and go into the door, and as soon as I walked in the door, there was a security camera on me. And I walked to the clerk and I said, turn that camera so it's on the door to the arcade over there. So he did. So I opened the arcade there and I said, you motherfuckers, cops come up here and talk this bullshit with Ray Hill, and I closed the door. Well, it's seconds, I'm swarmed. There's cops everywhere, all over me. And so I get arrested. And we go to a little holding station over in the corner of 610 and 59. And from there we go out to McCowa Street because I'm being charged with aggravated assault on a police officer and interrupting a police operation. So I get out to the McCowa Road, and the chief jailer, who's supposed to have been off the work for hours, comes running out, opens up the squad car and says, Mr. Hill, are you all right? And I said, well, these handcuffs are a little tight. He said, we'll take care of that. Take those handcuffs off, Mr. Hill. And said, would you like to sit in my office until your release is arranged? I said, I have no intention of arranging a release. I'm in custody and I deserve a cell, preferably one with a telephone. And so he puts me in a whole cell block all by myself with a bunch of telephones. And he finds a nice older black officer to come in and keep me company. And then he comes in and says, Mr. Hill, we have new fingerprint equipment. It's all electronic now. It's not like the old ink. Do you mind if we finger? I said, I don't think they've changed much, but I don't mind that. So they carry me to the fingerprint department to get fingerprinted electronically. And of course, the people in the fingerprint don't know what's going on. Now, who is this guy? He's got all these captains and chief jailers. He's riding to this. And I said, well, I'm Judon Boney's brother. And so they fingerprint me. Well, I get out of jail slowly. And when I get out of jail, we go to court, set up for trial. Judge Peters is the judge. He calls a panel of 50 potential jurors. 50, that's unusual for a misdemeanor court because the assaulted police officer just kind of vanished. And so I'm a misdemeanor trial. So I go in, there's 50 potential jurors, and Judge Peters says to the prosecutor, produce the officers. We're going to proffer Mr. Hill for identification. We need to proffer the officers as well. And she said, the officers have all been suspended and they're not currently Houston police officers. He said, well, why did they get suspended for? Filling out false documents. In what case? This one. Well, I'm just going to dismiss this charge because if they've been suspended for filling out false, I don't like we've got much evidence here, because they had gone back to the station house and they wrote down a myriad of activities. They said I went back into the arcade, that I knocked on doors, that I told people, you better get out of here, the cops are here. I even told an officer testified under oath on a piece of paper that I had told him to leave because the cops were there. They went through all of this, and the whole thing's on videotape. Start to finish. The whole thing. If they did that once, why the f*** did they think they could do it again? I went back into court after one of my cases for refusing to identify myself in the basement of the courthouse. I tried that case myself, pro se, by myself, because I can get more into the record than my lawyers can. I've been known to tell more than one judge, you got to realize I'm not an officer of this court. I am a civilian, and I don't think you can deny me asking the question. And I've had more than one judge go back, talk to their advisors, and come back and say, you're right, Mr. Hill. So I can get all kinds of stuff in the record if I'm representing myself. But after I got through, I won that case. And then I left some papers on the defense table. And when I came back to get it, the two officers that testified against me, the prosecutor and the judge, were covied up at the bench. And I could hear the judge telling them, to get a conviction in this kind of case, you have to testify as to the following. They're training them to lie. They're training them. I hope things are better. But you see, those judges at that time were friends of mine. They didn't think anything of training police officers to lie because it's the normal course of business. If you're afraid to go to jail, you probably won't go to jail. And you'll never need to know that stuff. But you better get up every morning and hope and wish and pray that somebody goes to jail to protect your rights. Thank you. Favorite, obviously.